We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
With the election in November, many voters are looking at what issues matter to them. And for many Americans, the Second Amendment issue is one of the biggest that's going to be effective of their decision. And we're very fortunate to have with us Liberty Nation's editor-at-large, Jim Fight, who happens to be knowledgeable on all things guns and gunsmithing, rather interestingly. Jim, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Mark. Yes, that's right. I know everything about gunsmithing and guns in general, except for the things that I don't know.
Except for those, the unknown unknowns, I believe,
yeah,
was a Rumsfeld quote there. So, Jim, I want to kind of get a view from however many thousand feet that particular saying goes. I believe with inflation, it's now a lot higher. But a view of gun rights in America over the last few years, how they've been impacted, whether there's been an improvement in protecting Second Amendment rights, whether there's been a decrease. And now, of course, a lot of people may be thinking about this segment on the radio show, thinking that we're going to be talking solely about what Joe Biden's done. But I think the reality is, Jim, that the president really hasn't had much of an impact, and rather the main stories have been with regulations, in court decisions and things like this. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, and it's definitely been a mixed bag. You know, from a big picture point of view, it's definitely been a mixed bag. I suppose the ATF regulations you can put on Biden, since that's an executive branch agency. But yeah, I mean, on the flip side, you've got the Supreme Court rulings and other various court rulings, but like the Bruen case, which completely restructured how we have to view laws based on the Second Amendment, which is good for the liberty side because it makes it harder to ban guns. Then there's that so-called bipartisan Safer Communities Act that passed under Biden's leadership. It didn't do a lot. It kind of touched some of the surface level things in Biden's anti-gun plan, like raising the minimum age to buy so-called assault weapons, or enhancing the they couldn't get that per se, but now if you're under 21, you have an enhanced background check, which just digs deeper and looks at other things like mental health stuff, I think, mostly. But yeah, it's certainly not for lack of trying, though, Mark. He's certainly tried to get things to pass, but you've got those pesky Republicans and Supreme Court justices that just keep getting in the way.
Keep getting in the way. Now, you mentioned that there's some efforts to make it harder to buy guns, and there was a really fascinating poll, and you wrote about this on the pages of libertynation.com. It's a really fascinating poll by Rasmussen Reports, who, for my money, and I'm a dedicated poll watcher. It's pretty much 80% of the things that I write about on libertynation.com are examining polls and what's behind those polls. And so, for my money, Rasmussen Reports it's a top tier polling organization. In fact, 2016, they're pretty much the only one that nailed it absolutely right, the presidential election. But they had this poll out that you and I have discussed, and you wrote about, and there's almost a slight deficit in the questioning, but that's because of the nature of what it is. And they surveyed a big bunch of people about whether they thought it was too easy or too hard to buy a gun. Now, you really deep dove into this, Jim. What did you find?
Yeah, that poll, I'm with you on that. I'm a big fan of Rasmussen reports, but they kind of flabbergasted me with this poll because of what I would call their baseline question. The big headline question was that 49% of respondents thought that it was too easy to buy a firearm. But sort of from my perspective, their baseline question, have you or anyone in your immediate family bought a firearm in the last year? To which 80% responded no. So only 20% of the people that we get this 49% from, now that has bought a gun in the past year. That doesn't mean they don't own guns. It doesn't mean that they haven't, that they've never bought a gun. It just means that the other 80% has not bought a gun recently. And then, of course, you can dig down because it's sort of a dual question, right? It's have you or anyone in your immediate family. So it's not even that 20% of these people have bought a gun. It's that 20% of these people have either bought a gun or, somebody else in the house probably did.
Yeah, it makes the the sample size, and that's really the point of the article that you wrote. That
Right, yeah, their total sample size was like 1,200 and some change, but 80% of that's like 1,000 people. So you got like a 200 person survey is really what it comes down to as far as people who have a recent experience with buying firearms.
yeah, it's pretty fascinating. But then, of course, just to play devil's advocate on this, there's also a number of people who might respond to a casual question about whether they purchased a firearm or a family member has by denying it.
Yeah, I I figure your yeses are kind of your middle of the road people. Your yeah, we bought a gun in the last year are probably the people who have either bought their first gun in the last year or they've just they've only got a couple of guns. I almost guarantee that guy with 20 guns in the basement did not answer yes to that question.
Yeah, that's pretty much where my mind was going on that.
Yeah,
So let's
I
talk
figured
about
as
that.
much.
Is it harder now to buy a gun than it was, say, 10 years ago, to buy a firearm of any description?
10 years ago, maybe in price. As
Okay.
far as actual regulation, I don't think it's really any harder. Yeah, I don't think it's any harder than it was 10 years ago, other than it's just more expensive.
Yeah, it does seem that a lot of people's understandings of what it takes to get a gun, to get a gun license, a firearm license in many places, which has certainly changed somewhat, the firearm licensing part
Well,
with
that's true.
the
The licensing part
Bruin,
has changed.
the Bruin decision. Yeah, it seems that there's a big push for a narrative that you can buy a firearm as easily as you can buy a soda.
Yeah,
And that does seem to be the dominant narrative in the big box media. And from my understanding, Jim, that's entirely false, isn't it?
that is, well, I don't know, man. I guess it depends on if you want the original Coca-Cola recipe with
Oh
the
yeah, well
cocaine in it,
there you
then
go, right?
yes, buying a gun is probably easier. Uh, but no, I mean, I've never had to fill out an ATF form to get a soda.
Sure.
So, or have have a criminal background check for a soda.
And there's this recently in the media, there's been this discussion about closing the gun show loophole, which I'm fairly sure actually never existed.
There was no such thing as a you could and I mean you could call it a gun hole loophole. You can call it whatever
Gun
you
show
want. It's not a
loophole,
thing. It's
a gun hole loop
uh
show.
yeah, yeah. No, there's this idea that and that's the most I'm going to give it credit for is just that it's an idea that like, oh, you can go to a gun show and buy guns without a background check. What they're trying the picture they're trying to paint here is that like, oh, there's these unregulated people. They've got, they pull up in a van and set up a table, and you go in there and buy a M60 machine gun, no background checks. But that's just, I mean, that's not how it works. You can sometimes find some really cool guns at gun shows, sure, but but under federal law, you're either a licensed dealer or you're not a dealer legally.
Right.
And if you are a dealer without a license, then you're a felon. you know,
So they're essentially trying to do away with something that is non-existent in the first place and only perpetrated by criminals. Why haven't they thought about this with regards to other crimes? If they regulated murder, I'm sure the homicide rate would drop dramatically, wouldn't it, Jim?
I know, right? And yeah, no, it's yeah, it's crazy some of the things that people actually will believe. Um, and if and it's not all narrative. I mean, there are actual lawmakers who believe some of this stuff. You can definitely tell when you watch their little videos and listen to their sound bites. But overall, for all that Biden has tried to quote unquote end the gun violence epidemic, he uh he hasn't affected a lot of change, and that's something we should be thankful for.
Well, that's, I guess, proves the enduring strength of the United States
It's
Constitution.
almost like there's a constitution.
Yeah, it's almost as though, right?
Yeah.
Jim Fight, thanks ever so much for being with us.
Hey, thanks for having me, Mark.
And that's just about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network from our flagship station in Washington, D.C. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to take a moment to thank our guests on today's show. Longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner, Scott Cassenta, who joins us as always to talk liberty, and Jim Fight, joining in for a special discussion on gun rights in America. And of course, I want to thank you, the listeners at home, for taking the time to join us week in, week out. You really are appreciated. Thanks for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.